Hello everybody, and welcome back to Photo Chat Vlog on YouTube with me, James Davis, and a vase of flowers, which I think really contributes to the proceedings. Now, it's been a while since the previous video. I know it's been a while. You know what knocked everything for six. But for now, I'm back, and this is a long overdue video about the Minolta Hi-Matic 7S, which is a really nice rangefinder film camera. And one of the things that is cool about it is that for an old camera from the 60s, it doesn't need a battery. Now, there is a battery cover on this camera, but it doesn't have one in it because it has instead the EV or exposure value system, which allows you to set the controls to get a reasonably exposed photo when you're shooting outside. Who'd have thought in 2021 you could have an EV without a battery? Anyway, I wanted to make a video, not so much about the camera, although I do hope to chat a little about it, but because you may recall I was playing with these fairy lights in a previous video, Season 4, Episode 1, and I was using them to pre-expose film for some unpredictable and crazy effects. Now, one of my viewers saw this video and asked the sensible question, have I tried pre-exposing them in the camera? And I rather think that they had a point, because I hadn't. So what I want to do today is to double expose these lights on top of some pictures that are already on this film. I think it will be worth a try for sure. So for the purposes of this experiment, in this camera I have a 36 exposure Fuji colour film, and there are 2 shots left. Now, I originally got the film out of a disposable camera a few years ago, when a well-known chemist store chain in the UK was selling Fuji disposable cameras for cheaper than an actual roll of Fuji film. So I loaded the Hi-Matic with this roll, and when I shot this video, it was late May 2020, and I had been out taking photos on it. And what I'm going to do now is rewind the film and take photos of the fairy lights over the top of those photos. This is what I mean by double exposing. Now, with the 2 remaining shots, I'll be taking photos just of the fairy lights, perhaps for a kind of control reference. There is actually no real science to this. What I wanted originally was coloured blobs, and I'm almost certainly going to get those if I take photos of the fairy lights from this very close distance. Now, left over from when I last used the camera, I had it set to an EV of 16, which is f16 with a shutter speed of 250. And I'm going to take the shutter speed down to 60 and take the aperture down to f4, which then comes to an EV of 10. And all I'm going to do is take a photo, and then take a couple more until we get to the end of the roll. Since the Photo Chat Vlog table is dark, I'm not going to set up any kind of special background here. I'm just going to shoot the fairy lights against the table so that I can get the double exposures. But what I'll do next is hit the film release button on the base and start to wind the film into the canister. Windy, windy, windy. And what I'm going to do is listen for the little click when it starts to come loose at the start of the film. I can feel it getting looser as I wind, and this is certainly a lot more of an easier way to rewind a film for these purposes than if I had a motorised rewind like in a compact camera, which usually winds the film all the way back into the canister. Now, that makes sense to protect an exposed film, but I need a little bit of the leader so that I can reload the film for the double exposures. Now there's the click. Now that I can sense that it has come off the winding on leader, I can safely open the back, and you can see that there is the film. What you can't see yet is that I wrote on it originally. Now let's pull that out, and you can see I wrote start on it, which is how I hope to align this so that my double exposures sit roughly on top of the pictures I'd already taken on the film. After a bit of Manoeuvring, I think we are in the same place as I was when I loaded the camera, and in theory this will mean that the two sets of images will line up, and there won't be problems for the film processing company who are going to scan this film and will have to decide how to frame the final images. So what I'm now going to do is what I did a few moments ago, and just take photos of the fairy lights as randomly as I can. Hopefully all over the photos that I took the day before. Now I'm more or less leaving the controls the same for each fairy light shot, although I will be moving the focus to see if that makes a difference. Now this was actually a bit boring to do, and I did notice that there seemed to be a bias towards green when I was taking the shots. So I did try and rearrange the lights from time to time to try and shake things up. I was a bit worried at one point as the winding started to feel a little bit lumpy, and I was concerned I had torn the film inside the camera by shooting everything so quickly. But the tension has remained, so it must just be an old camera thing. Now with the roll fully shot, it's time to rewind, and this time it was all going to go right into the canister. And you can see as I take it out that there it is, the funny unbranded Fujifilm from the disposable camera that I was talking about earlier. Now after all of that malarkey, I sent the film off to be developed and scanned, and what did I get? Well, I did get a whole roll of images. I'm not going to talk about them all, but I will show them all after a little chat about some of the ones that I think are more interesting. So let's start with a scan of where I wrote start, which is kind of cute. And we'll move on quickly to the classic start of film burn-in shot, where you can see the overly exposed film on the left, and then the velvet light trap in the middle, and the start of the properly exposed film on the right. Now whilst this might seem rubbish to some people, this is an interesting shot to me, as you can see how the fairy lights were rendered on the film with this technique. I definitely got the coloured blobs I was after, but I also got what are known as bokeh, which are the geometric shapes caused by the shape of the shutter blades and internal reflections in the lens. Basically, although I had the lights far too close to the camera to be in focus as individual LEDs, some of the lights have nevertheless got distinct shapes that are relative to their colour. Now I can't say this is exactly what I was expecting, and it's definitely different to my previous pre-exposing technique from the earlier video in episode 1. We'll have to see how this turns out across the film. Now again, in terms of rubbish shots, I think the next shot is my hand over the lens, which is easily done in a rangefinder camera where you don't get a through-the-lens view of exactly what you're looking at. But what's really apparent here is that despite my best efforts to line up the two sets of images, they didn't quite match in the end. It looks like we were out by maybe just one sprocket, and the processors seem to have favoured the original, more recognisable images for framing the final shots, rather than the abstract fairy lights, which is why we get this vertical line towards the left of the images. Now this is actually the gaps between the frames of the pictures that I took of the fairy lights. It is ultimately an aesthetic outcome and a decision I'm quite happy with. It's this sort of chance, aleatoric element to the experiment, which I was entirely open to. So let's whiz forward to this tasty road sign. Now, I love the words that we can all see in everyday life, and I like it because they can't be ignored. You know that this sign means something, even if you can't understand the actual language, because the language of the sign is designed to catch your eye. In the background are terraced, 3-storey houses, and of course in front are the colours of the fairy lights. And I think it's significant that I do say in front, because they most definitely do seem to be in front of everything. It must be related, of course, to how they blot out parts of the image by saturating the film with their photons. It's interesting that there are some legitimate coloured blobs in this image, and these are the traffic lights that are set at red. Now moving on, we have 4 photographs focusing on this telephone box, which is now a small community library. And this one, focusing on the books on the shelves in the telephone box library, is actually the closest so far to the coloured blobs effect that I wanted to originally achieve. The fairy lights here are causing washes of colour rather than distinct patterns. It's interesting that the gap between the frames which expose the lights on the left is vertical, meaning that it blends fairly seamlessly with the vertical lines of the telephone box, and it stands out less noticeably than in previous images. Compare it to this one, where the lights have the distinct bokeh effect of the aperture. It's hard to say what this image ultimately means. It was an experiment. Does it work? I don't even think I know. Crossing the street, we can see the telephone box library next to a normal functional telephone box. And there are, of course, lots of coloured shapes. Now there's an echo here for me with the foliage on the tree that brings out that sensation of looking at something from underneath a tree when you have shadowy leaves in your vision, occluding objects that are further away. Our minds learn to see over time, and so we can tune in and out of a scene like this without any worry. But with the coloured shapes interfering with things in this experimental image, it's perhaps not so easy. Now in this next image, we have more words from everyday life. In this case, a highway code instruction to traffic. Even without the coloured blobs, the framing of this photo highlights how, in towns, we are surrounded by instructions and rules and regulations. Towns are ordered and planned, and signs like this one make up that fabric of rules and instructions. Even with the tie-dyed, blurry green and yellow shapes, the authoritarian nature of this word is undiminished. And in this image, we come back to these bins, which I pass by regularly and which I photographed before and talked about in episode 9 of season 3 of Photo Chat Vlog. And in this image, I'm struck by how chance has placed the coloured double exposure in very harmonious positions, with a green stripe above the green bin, a purpley wisp near the purple bin, and a red blob over a bin that isn't necessarily red, but which highlights it as an object. Now this everyday scene ends up looking a little bit jollier as a result. But isn't it amazing that the chance arrangement of these frames ended up this way? This wasn't planned. Now this shot is an interesting one. There is, of course, a black letter X shape here. But we know this is not a linguistic mark. It is instead an architectural, structural motif, the visible part of an anchor that presumably keeps this old wall straight and true. Isolated in the photographic frame, there is something fascinating going on with the pattern of the brickwork and the anchor, like a strange inky doodle on an old school desk. It isn't obvious here when the X-shaped anchor was added, or what story there may have been around that circumstance. It just ends up here on your screen as a digital image, with me talking about it to you. And after rambling on like that, what more can I say? Well, again, look at how chance placed that yellow pentagon in just the right place on that X-shaped wall anchor to render it like some sort of religious symbol, floating with some sort of meaning above a washed-out sea of coloured shapes. You saw me earlier taking the photographs of the fairy lights with no concept of what images I was shooting on top of. If I'd tried to plan this or execute it in some sort of post-production technique, I would have laboured over the result and may never have even achieved anything. But here, without even trying, something has happened that just sort of works. Now finally, this image isn't especially interesting in terms of composition, but it makes me think about the film itself, even though all I was doing was experimenting. So the red flowers really pop out here against the green background, almost as if it was a professional film like Kodak Ektar 100 and not something that I'd salvaged from a cheap disposable camera. I think it certainly looks like it had plenty of space for all of the photons I was throwing at it. Perhaps a 400 ASA film was a bit fast for this, and I could have tried a slower 100 or 200 ASA film. But it was a case of rock what you got, and the 400 was what I had to rock. Now you can just see the vertical line on the left between the fairy light double exposure frames, and it does give something of an idea of what the shot might have been like without all that experimenting. But what I think it shows best is that the EV system on the camera works, since this and all of the shots all look nicely exposed, and you can also see how great the lens on the Hi-Matic is. It is lovely and sharp, and I'm excited about this camera all over again when I see these images, and I want to go straight out and start shooting once more, but it's dark outside right now, so I can't. Now at this point, I will put together all of the images with a little bit of music, and I'll let them play as a slideshow if you want to see the whole lot. And whether you fast forward or click away, if you stick around, I'll finish up with some final thoughts on the whole endeavour. And we're back. So what did I think of all of this ultimately? As a means of getting the colours of the fairy lights onto the film, this method was much easier and much more successful than my previous attempt in Season 4, Episode 1. As with so many double exposure experiments, it definitely gave me that chaotic and random, unexpected feeling I was looking for. but I kind of think I overdid it too. In retrospect, if I do try this again, I might only do half of the film with double exposures. It would be interesting too to see if taking the photos of the fairy lights first makes any difference or not. What do you think? Have you ever tried anything like this? Drop me a line in the comments if you have. Our photo chat vlog will be back. I will definitely be back. And for those of you that waited, thank you. Now, if this is the first time you visited the channel and you've seen a video of mine, why not take a look at my other videos and subscribe to see when that elusive next video eventually arrives, assuming that you're into experimental film photography. Until that time, take care and enjoy taking photographs.